open borders, shameful abandonment, disregard for human life, the prospect of more mandates and lockdowns, and the list goes on. Now more than ever, we need to stick together. Voting alone is not enough. We must use our dollars to support like-minded companies that fight for our rights and beliefs. Patriot Mobile is America's only Christian conservative wireless provider who shares your values. Last year, we gave more than $500,000 to conservative causes. With your support, we'll give more than $1.5 million this year. It's time to band together and support companies that truly love America and fight for our freedoms. Will you join us?
This is Kentucky's Voice Radio, covering the latest state and local issues with Tom Fallbush, Bob Scott, and Jim Waters.
All right, welcome to Kentucky's Voice. Welcome to a very special edition of Kentucky's Voice. This is something I've been looking forward to all week, and this is a special July 4th version of the program, and we want to focus on Kentucky and the settlement of Kentucky and how it impacted the Revolution, how it impacted the founding of the country. And if you don't know anything about the founding of Kentucky, just the early days, it is one of the most dramatic stories in American history. It's just the way the settlers came in and had to tame the land, build the roads, basically protect their homes and families from dangers in the frontier. And it was just the struggle and how that impacted the Revolution, because coming across the Appalachians and settling Kentucky because it was against their interests. So you had basically the war, the Revolutionary War, was going on in Kentucky as much as it was back east in Boston and the Carolinas and everything else. So, but yet out here was a little bit more brutal because it was a little more, Indian warfare and that sort of thing. So, fascinating stories. We're going to get into that the whole hour today, and I've got a special guest I'm going to bring on right now. It's Jim Holmberg, who is the curator emeritus at the Filson Historical Society, and we're very pleased to have Jim on with us today. And so, Jim, welcome to the show. Welcome to Kentucky's Voice. And so we're going to talk about all things early Kentucky. And when you think of early Kentucky, you think of a few big names, right? You think of, well, number one, Daniel Boone, right? So, if you're sure most people have heard of Daniel Boone, maybe you've seen his story, maybe seen the TV show from the 60s, maybe seen a little history here or there. But just the real authentic Boone is just a fascinating character. So we want to get into that. We want to talk about James Harrod a bit, founder of Harrodsburg, George Rogers Clark, and really anybody else you want to bring up that impacts the founding of the state. But let's, Jim, talk to us about, I'll tell you what, first segment, I want to talk about the Filson Let's talk about the Filson Historical Society. If you don't know what this Filson Historical Society is here in Louisville, you should. It's sort of the vault of all thing historical in this area, and you need to go visit it and get connected with it. Just tell us about Filson, what goes on there.
Okay. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you today, Tom, and
yes,
to talk about the Filson and, of course, Kentucky history and some of its early, I'll say, heroic characters. The Filson was founded in May of 1884. We're Kentucky's oldest continuously operated historical society. We're privately supported. We get some occasional government grants, but we're privately supported. We have collections that span from pioneer Kentucky right up to the present day. Our strengths are pioneer, antebellum, Civil War, Kentucky, and women's history, African American history for certain periods. We're always out there collecting. We have a wonderful art collection. We have some 900 portraits in our collection going back to the early days of Kentucky and some of its most famous artists like Matthew Jewett and Oliver Fraser, Joseph Bush, and others. Our library has approximately 50,000 volumes in it, again, focused on Kentucky and the Ohio Valley. A lot of genealogy. Kentucky was a real funnel state, coming from the east, then to the west,
Right.
and then spreading out from Kentucky north, south, and west. So we get a lot of visits from genealogists. So, and our programming, we have a very, very strong, robust program. We average 1 to 2 programs of various historical topics and reaching out to the community.
And you're located.
Week. So
and you're
that's
located.
kind of us in a nutshell.
Yeah, and you're located down in Old Louisville. So I encourage people to go visit and get involved with the programs. Go to the website, and we'll pull that up here this next segment. But it is just a real treasure to have something like the Filson. And to your point, Kentucky is sort of the funnel state. It's almost like the heart of the West in a sense. It's the first state that the colonies sort of branched out from to settle the rest of the country. So I really consider Kentucky the heart of America for lots of reasons. But okay, we'll be right back with Jim with the Filson Club. We're going to talk to Daniel Boone.
To Kentucky's Voice Radio, online at kyvoice.org.
All right, welcome back to Kentucky's Voice. We're doing a special program today, a special July 4th program. Of course, this is airing on July 3rd, but still, it's celebrating the founding of this country, and Kentucky had a huge role to play. Believe it or not, it wasn't one of the original 13 colonies, but it was a territory, I guess at the time, as part of Virginia on some level, but there was a lot that went on in Kentucky that impacted the Revolution, and so specifically the settling of Kentucky. And so we wanted to bring on some experts that could talk about the history and in a real deep way. So we brought on an expert from the Filson Society, Filson Historical Society. I want to pull up their website real quick too. If you haven't heard of the Filson, you should connect with it. If you're interested in history at all, Kentucky history, it is just a treasure. And they've got a great website. They have a lot of programs you can get involved with. And Jim, you want to mention anything about the website that people could?
Yeah, the website is, of course, as all websites, is constantly evolving. But you can see from what you're showing there, Tom, that we have exhibits that people can look at. We have the Old Filson Club History Quarterly is available online for people to read old articles going back to the 1920s, and we're in partnership. And some of our current journal, Ohio Valley History, is also available on that as well. But it lists our programs. You can look at our databases for collections, digital collections. The First American West is a tremendous site, along with others that we have. We have a YouTube channel. So I encourage people, filsonhistorical.org. Go to it, and it'll keep you busy for hours.
Yeah, it's awesome stuff. For history nerds like me, it's a great place. Okay, let's get into it. Okay, so the founding of Kentucky. Kentucky was a territory of Virginia in a sense. It was this area that really the British in the colonial period kind of wanted to keep the English colonists out of. And I think they had correct me if I'm wrong, I think they had a policy of they wanted to keep the Appalachians as a border between the more Native American lands versus colonial lands. But at the same time, you had the English settlers, the colonists that were exploding in their population, and they were very land hungry. And the average family was like 10 kids, right? And so you needed some place for those families to expand to. So land was an issue, and so tell us about how that worked. So the Wilderness Road, the founding of the state, what was going on there, and who was Daniel Boone?
Well, you mentioned that proclamation line of 1763, Tom, and that was the British government saying, don't go beyond that, basically the crest of the Appalachians. And they were concerned about how the Indians would react, the native indigenous peoples. It was a government policy, and many of the colonists at that time weren't having it. They wanted land. They were land hungry. Land speculation was very common. It was a way to make a lot of money or possibly go bust, and many did. Boone ultimately, lost all his land and moved to Missouri in 1799.
That's right.
So as the population pressure builds westward, everything's greener on the other side of the hill or the mountain. And so people like Daniel Boone, who was living on the frontier already, he's one of those early what's called the long hunters. And he, in 1769, went on a long hunt with some others into Kentucky. He thought of it, and this was a common phrase used, was an Eden of the West, this wonderful Garden of Eden. Goes back, touts it. Tries to make an attempt in 1773 to move in and create a settlement, but they're attacked by Indians, and his son James is actually killed, as are some others.
That's right.
And then finally, he's back in 1775. James Herod is in 1774, and really from 1774 and then permanently 1775 on is when settlements from the Euro-Americans, Virginians, Pennsylvanians, North Carolinians, Marylanders, and others are all then pouring into Kentucky. And that's where you have the beginning with the Revolution, and then with the Native peoples, essentially a 20-year war in the Ohio Valley of the Native peoples trying to maintain control and keep the Kentuckians mostly, and then others out, and then others that just keep pouring in.
Right. And yeah, people don't appreciate how contentious that period was here in the state. And I've mentioned this a lot in previous programs, but whenever you see a street name with the word station behind it, that was basically a place where settlers would go and rally to defend themselves, defend their communities, and against Indian attacks. And they had, because they basically had to come into the area and build a fort, and build just to survive here. And so, but tell us, what was Kentucky like? What did it look like? What was the landscape like in Kentucky when it was first settled? I heard these stories of these buffalo trails that were like highways and just herds of buffalo and just the game and, the bluegrass. Yeah. Describe what Kentucky was like before, in that time.
Well, Kentucky, hearkening again back to that Eden of the West, you have the mountains in the east, and then once you get over them, you get into the bluegrass region. Which Boone said was just this wonderful kind of mix of trees and prairies and just a marvelous place full of game, plenty of water, many streams, rivers, salt works, salt springs. That was really Kentucky's first industry beyond hunting. Plenty of game, and then much farther out to the west. Towards the Mississippi, again, it was a trackless wilderness with tons of potential, and Boone and others saw this as the land of kind of milk and honey, and so they wanted to come in and not only claim a lot of land but also live here. And the Native peoples, of course, weren't having it. From the south, the Creek, the Cherokee. From the north, the Shawnee, Miami, Delaware, Wyandot, Mingo. They wanted to hold on to this land, and hence you get that war. In fact, in John Filson's 1784 map of Kentucky, one of the main routes he shows amongst those early settlements is the Warrior's Path. And that essentially is going from north of the Ohio southeastward into the Virginia settlements, into the mountains, and then beyond. So it shows again how the native peoples were already in this country, using by this time primarily as a hunting ground. It wasn't heavily populated by the native peoples, but they wanted to hang on to it because they realized what the ultimate outcome may be with this almost tidal wave of white population moving over the mountains into Kentucky.
Yeah, I had a professor at U of L, and he made a great point about this moment, or this dynamic, and he called it competition of land use, is how he described it, and he basically had a primitive hunter-gatherer society that a very small population, but they needed a large amount of land to hunt and to survive, and then you have these culturally more advanced colonists that had agriculture and sophisticated methods of utilizing the land and making it productive, and so they didn't need as much land, but of course they could sustain a higher population. So you had this dynamic. I mean, if you just look at it objectively, just two different people groups that had different sets of needs that inevitably were going to come to a clash, and outside of just the way they treated each other, there's just a dynamic there, just economically and how things work. And but tell us about we got about 3 minutes left in this segment. The Wilderness Road. How does the Wilderness Road and Boone relate? What was going on there?
The Wilderness Road, Boone cut that under the directions of Richard Henderson, who had actually tried to form a private colony called the Transylvania Colony. He had bought a huge tract of land in Kentucky from the Cherokee at the Treaty of Sycamore Shoals in 1773. And Virginia, of course, also was claiming Kentucky. And so that became, it's kind of like who's going to get the upper hand. So the Wilderness Road basically followed the Warrior's Path from southeastern Kentucky, the Cumberland Gap area, into the heartland, into the bluegrass area. And just as many of the other roads and early routes followed, like buffalo traces, game trails, things like that, as people kept branching out. But the Wilderness Road became the major land route into Kentucky, and it's famous, but the Ohio River was actually a much bigger highway, because starting out from Pittsburgh and other points further upriver, people would be on their flatboats, and they would be coming down with their household effects, families, things like that, coming down the river. And so between the two, especially after those first really tough years during the Revolution and during that first 20 years of the conflict with the native peoples, they were pouring in by the thousands, and Kentucky's population was almost literally exploding.
Mr. Producer, I've got a map here of the Wilderness Road and that area, if you can pull it up, but that's interesting. So because when you think of Daniel Boone, you think of the Wilderness Road, but I think James Harrod, who was a contemporary and who started, because you had Boonesboro and then you had Harrodsburg, right? So two early settlements. So Harrod came in from the river.
Fort.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah, right. They went into the heartland, and so they weren't founded really along rivers that way, but they were in good parts with a lot of hunting, good farmland, things like that. And so between them and then Logan's Fort, which was the third one, they managed to hang on. Harrodsburg, founded in 1774, briefly abandoned, and then Boonesboro 75, Logan's Fort 75.
Got it. Good deal. This next segment, we're talking about Boone and just the struggles and just the stories that are just amazing stories with Boone in this next segment. We'll be right back here, Kentucky's Voice, talking about early Kentucky history around the Revolution. Yeah, perfect.
Now, back to Kentucky's Voice Radio, online at kyvoice.org.
All right. Welcome back to Kentucky's Voice. We're talking about early Kentucky history. And, of course, it's July 4th. It's the 250th anniversary of this founding of the country. And Kentucky had a big role to play in that. And just the stories of Daniel Boone, James Herod, George Rogers Clark. I mean, just some of the best epic stories in American history happened right here in this state, right here in this county. If you're listening to this radio station, a lot of it happened right here in Louisville. And it was, like I said earlier in a previous show, if it wasn't for George Rogers Clark, Indiana would be Canada right now. So a lot of things happened here that really impacted how we live. And so we're talking about Daniel Boone in the last segment. Let's continue that story, and James Herod. And so Boone came in from the Wilderness Road, and he created a settlement, right? And he brought his family in, and just unpack that a little bit, and just Boonesboro, and then Harrodsburg, and then what happened from there.
Okay, sure. Well, after Boone's failed attempt in 1773, in which his son James was killed, they had to go back to the other side of the mountains. And then 2 years later, after the Treaty of Sycamore Shoals, in which Henderson bought from the Cherokee a good chunk of Kentucky, and then Boone, as his representative, cut the Wilderness Trail, founded Boonesboro. James Herod was back at Harrodsburg, and then Benjamin Logan was at St. Asaph's or Logan's Fort. So those three infant settlements were the first permanent settlements into Kentucky, and from there others would join. And with the war starting in the east, the British soon focused on what was going on in the West, and tried, along with their Indian allies, to push the settlers out. So there you get an ongoing war, and some of the early episodes focus on Boonesboro and Daniel Boone. Sometimes not only with British troops or Canadian militia, but also the Shawnee primarily, and some other tribes would lay siege to Boonesboro. They'd attack outlying settlements. There you see Boone in older life with the engraving, him and his dog and his rifle. And so he was the undisputed, really kind of leader, not only of Boonesboro, but also had I would say as good a relations with the native peoples as he could. And one example of this, I'll give you two, one violent and then one actually more peaceful. In 1776, his daughter Jemima and the two Callaway girls were captured by a party of Shawnee, and I think one Cherokee was in there with them, and were getting taken north. Back to the Indian villages, and Boone, John Floyd, who is a big name here in Jefferson County, early leader of the colony or of the county, pursued them. Simon Kenton, I think, was along also, and some others, and they caught up with them and attacked the small party of Indians. And Boone said later in life that he, to his knowledge, only killed 2 Indians his whole life. This life on the frontier. And one of them was in rescuing his daughter and the Callaway girls. Then in 1778, he's captured at the Blue Licks. He's with a party of about 30 salt makers because they needed the salt to preserve their food, their meat. And he's out hunting and is captured by a rather large party of Shawnee, primarily led by Blackfish, Major Shawnee chief. And they're going to go ahead and attack the salt workers, and then even go on. And this is in the winter when very little of this would happen, down to Boonesboro. Boone convinces them that they should wait until later in the year for various reasons. So he must have been a pretty persuasive guy. But the salt workers are then captured, and Boone and them are taken north. Some are adopted or held captive in Indian villages, and others are taken up to Montreal and or Detroit, and mostly Detroit is where they often went to, and they were sold and held for ransom, things like that. So Boone is adopted into Blackfish's family, and he's given an Indian name, Sheltowee, meaning giant turtle or big turtle, and he fits in very well, and he seems to get along, and everything's pretty hunky dory, but he hears that they're planning a major invasion of Kentucky and an attack on Boonesboro for that June, and he escapes. He kind of uses some different ploys to earn their trust, and then he escapes, goes like 150 miles in a few days to get back to Boonesboro and warn them of the attack. Well, the attack is delayed until September. And because they've had the warning, they're ready to be prepared. They're prepared, and they fight the Indians off. And so that's a failed attempt. If Boone had not escaped and gotten ahead and warned them, Boonesboro more than likely probably would have been taken. They were already down quite a few men from all the salt makers that had been taken earlier that year. The interesting thing is that because the salt makers that had escaped or gotten back to Boonesboro said that he had been in league with the Indians and was friendly to the British. And there were British loyalists there amongst these early settlements. And so he's actually brought up and court-martialed for being in league with the British, charged with treason, but a court-martial finds him innocent.
Interesting.
And and so he continues to be one of the primary leaders. He leaves Boonesboro after that bad incident and founds a different settlement. But those are kind of two of the highlights in his life. And it goes on. I mean, the Indian Wars continue into the 1780s, even the 1790s, and he's active through many of these and has other adventures.
You know, that story of him rescuing his daughter and the Callaway girls, I think that was what really gave him a national prominence in the colonies. I read somewhere that, one of the great fears of moving west was the fear of conflict with the Indians, of, getting killed, scalped, getting kidnapped, getting your children, taken into slavery, which has very often happened, and so just that story of, well, maybe we can go west and protect our families and rescue our girls. And it was such a visceral, important story for Americans, and especially in that moment of westward expansion. I think that really just brought him to prominence. The moment, the period was when he was in that camp in Ohio as a captive of the Indians.
He'd been adopted into the tribe.
Adopted, but it was but it was still also like a captive slave sort of role in a sense, but still adopted, and so it's kind of a weird mix of going on there. So I can see how somebody would say, well, you went native, you went to the other side. Why were you gone so long? And da da da. But at the same time, he really didn't have the freedom to leave, and so he had to escape. And
right.
So it was kind of an interesting dynamic there.
Yeah, he had to bide his time until he thought he could safely escape. But when he knew an attack, an invasion was planned, he felt he had to get away. And so as far too, John Filson, in his book, The Discovery, Settlement, and Present State of Kentucky, published in 1784, which was a promotional tract for people to come to Kentucky.
Oh,
land of milk and honey, Eden of the West kind of thing. Filson he was a school teacher, but then he speculated in land. But he included an appendix in the book called The Adventures of Colonel Daniel Boone.
Oh,
and that became an international bestseller, was published in Paris, London, Ireland, Germany, and because of that, Boone becomes this international man of the frontier.
That's awesome.
And so really, there were many others like Simon Kenton and others,
Yeah.
that were
They
very,
had similar
very
exploits.
good.
Yeah, but the fact that Filson...
here comes Boone's promotion.
There we go. Because Filson promoted him, he really stood out from the rest. Well, that is awesome. Okay, we'll be right back. We're going to talk about more about Kentucky history. James Herod, George Rogers Clark.
To Kentucky's Voice Radio, online at kyvoice.org.
All right, welcome back to Kentucky's Voice. We have a special program today. We're talking about the founding of Kentucky and some of our early heroes and just how it impacted the Revolution and just what was going on 250 years ago here in Kentucky, especially right here in Jefferson County, where I'm broadcasting from. And we have Jim Holmberg with the Filson Historical Society, if I can say that word, a mouthful. Historical Society, and we were talking about Daniel Boone, and you mentioned this track that John Filson put together back in the 1700s about Boone. I'm going to pull this up, Mr. Producer, if you can. Here's the first page of that track. The Adventures of Colonel Daniel Boone, formerly a hunter, containing a narrative of the wars of Kentucky. And it was just supposedly this track, was what really brought Boone to prominence internationally, not just nationally, but internationally. So that's the first page. Any more comments on that?
Yeah, Filson interviewed Boone and got a lot of the information from him. He did include some facts that kind of actually belonged to other people, like maybe Simon Kenton. But Boone had done an awful lot, and he was well deserving of the attention and of the fame. But it made him an international man of nature and of adventure. And really, that's why, because if it hadn't been for Filson promoting him in his book, which again it was an international bestseller, he probably wouldn't have been near as famous and the iconic man of the frontier that he became. We might have had TV shows about Simon Kenton instead of Daniel Boone or something like that. But it was a well-deserved honor because Boone really was one of those major figures in Kentucky on the frontier during his formative years.
Yeah, fascinating. Him and other characters too. We're going to get into James Herod in a second, but let's talk real quick about just what was going on with the British vis-a-vis Kentucky and just west of the Appalachians, and just what would have happened if Kentucky, say Boonesboro fell. Right, and so say the Shawnee and the British agents that were pushing the Shawnee to conquer Boonesboro. What if that did happen? And do you think, how would that have impacted the revolution?
Well, that's a good question, Tom, because if the Kentucky settlements had been wiped out, had been abandoned, and if the British, with their Indian allies, had focused on the western frontiers of Virginia, and already Pennsylvania had a very active, and New York too, very active frontier war going on with some of the Iroquois tribes and others, and Loyalist Rangers and British troops. If that would have happened on the Virginia frontier, much more so than it did already, what would that have made a difference in the war along the coast?
Right.
Would Virginia have had to have filtered off more of their troops, more of their continental line, instead of having them focus with Washington and his army and the army in the South later? I mean, we don't know what actually would have happened, but it could have been a very serious threat, and maybe cause not necessarily the war to be lost, but certainly maybe to be extended farther. We just don't know. But the fact that the Kentucky settlements hung on and the British in the West had to focus on them instead of focusing on the more direct Virginia frontier, I think was significant.
That's a great point. And so, well, why don't we say, I was going to talk about Herod, just touch on Herod for 1 second. Then when I get back to George Rogers Clark, who plays into this, that discussion there, because he did take on, the British and the Indians on their own territory, in their home territory. But so who is James Herod? Because Harrodsburg, you can go to Harrodsburg now.
Yeah, James Herod was a frontiersman like Boone. He came in and founded Harrodsburg in 1774, and of course Harrodsburg is still there. I was there just last week. He was a leader. He was a colonel in the militia. He fought they believe he'd been in the French and Indian War, a land speculator. All these guys were crazy about claiming land and things like that. But he disappeared in 1792, I think it was. And we don't know what happened to him. His body, kind of like Filson. Filson disappeared in 1788 north of Cincinnati, and they believe he was killed by Indians. His body was never found. And Herod disappears in 1792, and his body was never found. And so they don't know what happened to him, whether it was an accident, the Indians got him, wild animals did, or there's even one theory that he might have been killed by his own men in the party that they were. So, but he's out of the picture and kind of relegated to the back bench, so to speak, of frontier heroes and adventurers, just because he founds Harrodsburg, he's there, and then he disappears.
Yeah, there we go. But it took men like that to cut a trail through the wilderness and be the first on the scene to do these heroic deeds. So, let's switch over to George Rogers Clark real quick. And now, if you haven't heard of him, you may have heard the Clark name, right? Lewis and Clark, and so that Clark of Lewis and Clark, I think, is George Rogers Clark's nephew. Is that right? Is it
his brother William, his youngest brother William?
Okay, there we go, youngest brother. Okay, so even closer. And so Clark was, a soldier? What was his actual title or role there? And so
he moves up the ranks. He was pretty well educated for the day. He learned surveying. He starts going in the early 1770s. He starts going over into the frontier along the Ohio River. In 1774, he participates in Lord Dunmore's War. He is commissioned as a captain. And then he comes down into Kentucky, and he's at Harrodsburg, and he becomes one of the leaders in the Kentucky settlements, and he works his way up. He becomes a major. He eventually becomes a lieutenant colonel and a brigadier general in the Virginia militia. He goes and has meetings with Patrick Henry, and these are guys, they didn't just plop down. They traveled all over the place, and Clark is a wonderful example. He's going back and forth between the Kentucky settlements to Richmond and Williamsburg in Virginia. He meets with Patrick Henry. He is influential in getting Kentucky County created so that Virginia lays official claim and a more stronger claim over the Transylvania colony, that it's going to be Virginia land. He convinces in 1778, he convinces Patrick Henry and Virginia legislature to allow him to raise a regiment of militia to invade the Northwest and attack 3 British forts. And here you're seeing a plan of the rapids of the Ohio, or as we say, the falls of the Ohio, landing on Corn Island, right there as you're showing, in May of 1778. He only raised about 170, 180 men of the proposed 500 for the regiment, but he takes those men, most of them down the river to where Paducah is now, and Fort Massac across the river, and on the 4th of July, 1778, he captures Kaskaskia, a British post, without firing a shot. The next day, Captain Joseph Bowman captures Cahokia, and then Leonard Helm goes over and takes Vincennes. Now, one of the great things that helped him is by then, the Franco-American alliance had been signed. And so he could go to the French settlers in all 3 of these towns and say, hey, now we're on the same side, and you don't like the British anyway, so side with us. And that's what they did. And Vincennes gets retaken by Henry Hamilton out of Detroit, better known as the hair buyer, because he paid bounties for American scalps and prisoners. And he comes down, retakes Vincennes in December of 78, plans to attack Kaskaskia in the spring. Clark hears about it, and he says, well, we can't just sit here because we won't be able to win. So he, in the dead of winter, in February, marches about 170, 180 men across flooded plains in Illinois, and then gets to Vincennes undetected, gets the people of Vincennes to side with him again against the British, who are in Fort Sackville there along the Wabash, and he lays siege. He fools them into thinking he has more men than he does, and then in what is a case of great psychological warfare, they capture an incoming war party of Indians that mistake the Americans for some of the French there in town, and he lines them up in front of the fort and tomahawks them. And tells Hamilton, this is what's going to happen to you if you don't surrender. And so Hamilton surrenders, and when he comes out and sees how many men Clark actually has, he's like, oh my gosh, I got fooled.
I was fooled.
But it was a great victory. And the march across where the water was often waist deep, shoulder deep, it was one of those still studied today as one of the great accomplishments of a military campaign. And so Clark is the conqueror of the Northwest, the George Washington of the West, the Hannibal of the West. He has all these wonderful nicknames. He wanted to take Detroit, the British stronghold there in the Northwest, but never could get the support, either men or money, supplies to get it done. And after that, his star starts to fade. He leads several expeditions into Indian country, destroying villages there, and it takes part in peace negotiations. But really, that's the high point of his career, and he ends up in debt, legal trouble. Alcohol becomes an issue, and it's really kind of a sad downhill slide from there.
Yeah. I heard. Well, only 40 seconds left. We'll get into more of this after. But after that march, which is basically like the Navy SEAL. I mean, you're not talking like special forces level heroism to do that kind of assault on Vincennes, and but that really took a toll on his health, and he really declined after that, and of course he died and was convalescing at Locust Grove here in Jefferson County.
Right.
So we'll talk more about that here in a second. So George Rogers Clark, founding of Kentucky. Here on Kentucky's Voice, we have Jim Holberg with the Filson Historical Society. Just tuning in, it's a great episode. We're celebrating the founding of the country and the founding of Kentucky, because Kentucky had a big role in that, believe it or not. And only a few people here, but big role. We'll be right back.
To Kentucky's Voice Radio, online at kyvoice.org.
Welcome back to Kentucky's Voice. Our last segment, I wish we had another 20 segments, because this is just one of my favorite topics, is just the early founding of Kentucky and just the settling. And Jim, just so you know, I don't know if you know, we did some genealogy. I'm related to the Boone family, not a direct descendant, but his cousin that came in right after. I'm a descendant of him. So anyway, old Kentucky stock here. You know, we go way back, but. So all this stuff is just very meaningful, and just the stories are so compelling. I mean, just Boone himself, and then you take Simon Kenton and Herod and George Rogers Clark, and we were talking during the break that, you know, you just wish somebody would do a really good movie on this stuff, because the narratives are so worthy of that, and so who knows? Any comments on that? Any
Wouldn't it be great? I mean, I know it would take a lot of work, but yeah, both of them, I mean, to have a really good biopic done on both, I think, you know, would be, you know, number one, very exciting, because they led exciting lives, and in a way, kind of tragic lives. I mean, Daniel Boone lost two sons in Indian fights, James in 1773, and then at the Battle of Blue Licks in August of 1782, which was really the last battle in the American Revolution.
That's right.
Post Yorktown.
That's right.
That was October of 81.
Yeah, north of Lexington.
The Kentucky militia got hammered.
Yes.
And it was another British invasion, and they got ambushed and just slaughtered.
Yeah.
And his son, Boone's son Israel, was one of those killed. And so, you know, they had tragedies in their life, and then Boone, in debt, loses his land, and he ends up in 1799 moving to Missouri. and takes a Spanish land grant and is a commandant there in the Femosage district, and supposedly said, when he left Kentucky, I'll never step foot in that damn place again.
That's right. He was very bitter.
Because he felt so bitter about how he'd been treated.
Yeah.
And the same with Clark. Clark, his reputation, he did have a drinking problem, and he was rather dictatorial and kind of how he commanded things and wanted things done. But, the proof is in the pudding, as they say, and he'd been tremendously successful and was a great leader. And he had people then that engaged in character assassination, like James Wilkinson, one of the great rascals in American history, who was buffeting his own reputation at the expense of Clark. Virginia's government and U.S., but primarily Virginia, really, they did not repay him. He had used a lot of his own money to prosecute the war in the West, and they left him holding the bag so that he had financial and legal troubles the rest of his life.
Wow.
And he was very bitter, and understandably so. And he has rheumatism. He has a series of strokes. He falls in 1809. He falls in the fire at his home over at Clark's Point.
Oh yeah.
And whether the story goes from he was drunk to he lost his balance because of his strokes to having a big stroke, burns his right leg so badly, gangrene sets in that it has to be amputated. And that's when he goes and lives the last 9 years of his life at Locust Grove, where his sister Lucy Clark Cron and her husband, Major William Cron, live. And of course, it's a wonderful historic home today where people can go and visit and learn about George Rogers Clark and the Locust Grove connection to the famous Lewis and Clark expedition. This is the only known building, verified building west of the Appalachians that we can put Lewis and Clark in together.
Oh, wow.
In November of 1806, when they returned from the expedition out west, William had helped George tremendously with his troubles, and in fact had impoverished himself. And when Lewis, his friend Lewis from their army days, says, hey, how about going out on this expedition to the Pacific with me? If Clark had been a successful farmer at Mulberry Hill, which is George Rogers Clark Park here in Louisville, is where that family home was. If he'd been a successful farmer, he may not have been inclined to do that and face all those dangers. But instead, he's like, hey, this is great. This is a chance for me to get back up on my feet. So his brother's troubles and him helping him actually kind of changed the course of American history in a way. And I think it's pretty fantastic, Tom, to think that George Rogers Clark, partly because of his exploits during the Revolution, doubled the size of the United States. In the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the British ceded the Northwest Territory.
That's right.
Which becomes 5 U.S. states. Eventually, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin.
That's right.
And I think a little bit of Minnesota. If he had not captured those 3 forts and done what he did, he and his followers, again, as you mentioned earlier, maybe that would have been Canada across the river.
That's exactly right.
And then to have his younger brother, William, come along, who goes as a leader of the Lewis and Clark expedition and explores the Louisiana Purchase and then goes on out to the Pacific to help lay a stronger U.S. claim to that area.
Yes. Yeah, the Louisiana
He's involved in doubling the size of the United States yet again. So here's these 2 brothers that have this tremendous impact on, and there's William Clark on the right, famous Charles Wilson Peale portrait, and Meriwether Lewis on the left, also by Peale. And so here's these 2 brothers that really truly were American heroes, and they aren't saints. I mean, there's things that you can be negative about regarding them, but for what they accomplished in their lives on for America, on behalf of America, is truly amazing.
Yeah. So that's a fascinating way to frame it. So two Clark brothers, both of them in their era, their time, doubled the size of the United States, and so that is that. I mean, just from their efforts, and so that's fascinating. And the whole issue with the British in the Northwest. Really wasn't settled until the War of 1812, because you had the British still hung out in Detroit, even though they ceded the Northwest Territory to the U.S. and said, okay, we lost, we're going to back out. They never left Detroit. They just still hung out there and helped give weapons and arms and support to the Native Americans who wanted to resist American expansion. And so it was, that whole area was still a bit dicey, but yeah, I would say this again. Indiana would be Canada if it wasn't for this man, and so
could have been.
Yeah.
It's possible. Yeah. I mean, they call the War of 1812 the Second American Revolution.
There we go.
Because of the British still in the lakes area, fomenting trouble among the native tribes to keep resisting American encroachments and all that. And it wasn't until after that really that danger, I'll say, was put to rest.
Put to rest, exactly right. Well, fascinating stuff. Just but just as so describe life, like we talked about this earlier, but describe life as a settler that came into the state for the first time. What was on their mind? What were they thinking? We only have 4 minutes left, but just say you're a settler, you're coming up in the Gap, or you're coming down the river, and you want to settle in, I don't know, Oldham County or something, or just somewhere in our district, Bullitt County. What are you thinking of? What was the life like?
Well, life was hard. I mean, unless you had a lot of money, and many brought their enslaved people with them too. Kentucky was a slave state, and you had your farm set up and people that did work for you. But the vast majority, they worked hard. I mean, they were scratching out a living on a farm. They might own land, they might not. They might be just tenants working a farm, or not even on land they own. And it was a hand-to-mouth existence, anything extra that they could sell. That's why whiskey became big, because they grow more corn than they could really save or use. So they'd distill it and make corn liquor and sell it downriver or to other people, things like that. But Kentucky was very rich, and so the orchards, the vegetable crops, the grain crops, sheep, cattle, horses, pigs. I mean, you could have a successful farm, but much of it was subsistence, and then you'd sell the extra you had. Women worked hard. I mean, they had to run the home, raise kids, and as you mentioned earlier, families often had 10 and 12 children. It was big because you wanted hands to work, right. And that's just kind of the way it was. With families. So it was hard unless you had a lot of money and had the wherewithal to hire people or own people that did a lot of that work for you. Life was tough. Yeah, but people kept coming because, again, that grass was greener on the other side of the hill, and they saw that opportunity, and they wanted to cash in and hopefully have a better life.
That's right. And it all started with land, because in the American experience, especially
land was it.
Because it was an agricultural economy, and so in order to do anything as the average person.
There's a term that's used called land poor. And actually, it's you're land rich. You might own a lot of land, but you may not have actual money to, 2 nickels to rub together, because it's all tied up in land.
Real quick, we have 90 seconds left. Well, what are some really famous or interesting spots in this area, in this general viewing area, that would be something to see, or something like for example, the Shepherdsville was known as a giant salt lick. And so it was a big salt operation for making salt, for the early settlers. So that's kind of interesting. Any other places in this area that might be worth making note of, just that history?
Yeah, well,
250 years ago.
Locust Grove is a biggie. If you want to, really see, and they were a well-to-do family, owned a lot of land, and Farmington, of course, is another early plantation. That's a historic home, and that has a really good Abraham Lincoln connection.
Right.
The salt works at Bullets Lick and Mans Lick, that was really one of Kentucky's first industries, but there's nothing left of them now. You can't see where they were. Fort Herod State Park is great. They have a replica fort there. There's a replica fort at Boonesboro as well in the state park. So, there's a number of things. Big Bone Lick, which was, from an archaeological standpoint, is a great place to visit as well. Yeah. And then, of course, get on the websites and check out other things. Yeah. Come to the Filson.
And check out the Filson Society. Yeah, well, listen, Jim, thanks for being on the show today. God bless America. Thanks for being on. We'll see you next week on Kentucky's Voice.